When it comes to games about the Wild West, very few titles can compare to the legendary Red Dead Redemption series. Today, we'll cover the whole Red Dead Redemption saga from both games. I'm Justice with the Leaderboard, and this is our Red Dead Redemption timeline. 1865, the Wild West era begins. It was a period of lawlessness and chaos for the American frontier. For 30 years, this untouched territory west of the Mississippi River was riddled with immoral gunslingers, cowboys, prospectors, and pioneers just running amok. It was a dangerous time. People cared less about their principles and more about their priorities. They would survive by any means necessary, even if it meant turning to a life of crime. 1872, the Pinkerton Agency versus the Wild West. The Pinkertons were the country's first national detective agency. During the frontier expansion, the Pinkertons were highly recruited by wealthy businessmen to help tame these uncharted territories of the West. They typically worked as bounty hunters for railroads and express companies, helping to protect their assets from the thieving gangs of outlaws. 1878, the Vanderlyn Gang is formed. Two young grifters named Dutch Vanderlyn and Hosea Matthews team up and form the legendary Vanderlyn Gang. The gang is all about personal liberties and true independence above all else. They oppose all government control, operating under the altruistic ideas of their leader Dutch. Dutch fancies himself a champion of the people, a real Robin Hood figure. The Vanderlyn Gang work together to shape the world into his vision of utopia. Dutch's natural charisma and idealism convinces his gang that they're actually making a difference in the world and changing it for the better. Later that year, a petty criminal named Arthur Morgan is taken in by Dutch at the young age of 15, becoming one of the first members of the notorious gang. 1885, John's history. Dutch rescues a 12-year-old orphan boy from a lynching in Illinois after he is caught stealing from a group of homesteaders. The boy has been killing and stealing since his father passed away, leaving him to fend for himself. This young boy is named John Marston. When John joins the gang, he meets Abigail Roberts, a working girl. Abigail was also orphaned as a young child and has spent most of her life barely getting by with her earnings from the local dive bars and brothels. She becomes pregnant with Jack Marston soon after John joins the gang. 1886. Arthur's Grudge. John and Arthur are Dutch's best protégés. They're like brothers, until John suddenly leaves the gang for unknown reasons shortly after Jack is born. John returns to the gang a year later, but his relationship with Arthur isn't the same. Arthur holds a grudge against John for abandoning his family. He feels betrayed, but never addresses it. 1899. Red Dead Redemption 2. The end of an era. Even the most notorious gangs have started to dwindle, but the feared Vanderlyn Gang is still hanging in there. They're still dreaming of that one last big score that will allow them to retire. At this point, there are 23 members in total, each ready to get rich. The Blackwater Massacre. The gang attempts a ferry heist in Blackwater that goes south and results in one of the biggest, most infamous shootouts in all the land. The Blackwater Massacre, resulting in a staggering number of police and civilian deaths. The exact numbers are unclear, but it's rumored that there is only one survivor aside from the gang itself, Mr. Landon Ricketts. The Vanderlyn Gang leaves their money and belongings behind and heads to the mountains to lie low until it's safe to return. But the weather is fierce, and the gang finds themselves unprepared for the dreaded snowstorm. Looking for shelter, they stumble upon a rival gang, the O'Driscolls. In addition to a warm place to post up, they learn of the O'Driscolls' plan to rob a train owned by the renowned businessman Leviticus Cornwall. The gang also rescues a newly widowed woman being held captive by the O'Driscolls, Sadie Adler. She becomes the newest member of the Vanderlyn Gang. The next day, Arthur and Javier Escuela go searching for John, who's gone missing in the snowstorm. The two find John nearly dead, with a new series of nasty scars on his face. The Pinkerton Agency versus the Vanderlyn Gang. Dutch changes the plan to lie low and decides to rob Cornwall's private train. Thanks for the inside info, O'Driscolls. The robbery is a success, but Cornwall hires the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency to track the gang down and bring them to justice. Valentine. After the robbery, the gang flees to the livestock town of Valentine, New Hanover. Arthur Morgan does his best to help the gang while they lie low, including rescuing gang members Micah Bell and Sean McGuire from a hanging. On top of that, Arthur pulls off another train robbery alongside John Marston. Agent Milton, head of the Pinkerton Agency, catches wind of Arthur's misdeeds and attempts to turn him against the gang. Even though Arthur refuses, Milton is on the gang's trail after a botched bank robbery shootout. With many of the lawmen in Valentine dead, the gang is forced to run again, and this time south towards Rhodes. But the Pinkertons aren't far behind. Rhodes, dominated by two prominent rival families, the Braithwaites and the Grays. Both families are rumored to have hidden gold somewhere within the city. Naturally, Dutch and Hosea devise a plan to steal the gold. They befriend each family to play them against each other. Arthur plays his part in inciting a war that will keep the families busy, while the gang runs off with the gold. Arthur and Dutch are both appointed deputies in the town, but it's all a ruse. The families are aware of the gang's plan to double-cross them, and instead ambush the gang first. After the gun smoke clears, Sean McGuire is dead, and little Jack Marston is kidnapped by the head of the Braithwaite house, Catherine Braithwaite. The gang takes down both families and learns that Jack is in the industrial city of Saint Denis, held captive by Italian crime lord Angelo Bronte. Saint Denis. Once they reach Saint Denis, the gang tracks down Jack and Bronte and negotiate the boys' release. Bronte provides Dutch with a tip on a score involving a local trolley station. Dutch begins planning his next move. Arthur assists in a riverboat casino heist, where he meets a Native American tribe leader named Rains Fall. Rains Fall's tribe is also being pursued by the government, and Arthur develops a strong friendship with him. Dutch attempts to follow through on the tip he received from Bronte, but it's bunk. There's no money to be had in the trolley station. A livid Dutch takes out Bronte and attempts to rob the local city bank, with Hosea and Lenny Summers getting killed in the process. John is taken into custody by the police, while the rest of the gang goes back into hiding. Dutch, Micah, and Arthur make off with the gold and hop on a boat to Cuba. Guarma. A massive storm sinks the boat, and Dutch, Micah, and Arthur are washed up on the small island of Guarma. Guarma is run by a ferocious dictator named Fusar. Fusar owns all the sugar fields on the island, and he makes his wealth off enslaving the locals. So, because of Fusar's brutal, harmless nature, Guarma is in the midst of a revolution. The gang befriends the locals and decides to help them break Fusar's hold on the people. With the help of a rebel named Hercule, the gang leads the locals in a raid on Fusar's compound. The people successfully end Fusar's tyranny, and the gang makes their escape back to Saint Denis. Ansburg. Dutch, Micah, and Arthur return to find the rest of the Vanderlyn gang camped out somewhere outside of Saint Denis, but the Pinkertons are hot on their trail. The Pinkertons devise an epic attack on the gang, forcing them to flee once more to Roanoke Ridge. It becomes apparent that Arthur's health is deteriorating. On his way to meet Sadie Adler in Saint Denis, Arthur has a coughing attack and collapses in the streets. A stranger takes him to a doctor, where he learns he's contracted tuberculosis and his days are numbered. Dutch knows that the Pinkertons' witch hunt is funded by Cornwall and decides to confront him as his ship arrives in Ansburg. Dutch tries to make a deal with Cornwall, and when the deal falls through, Dutch shoots Cornwall in the chest. With setback after setback, the gang is on decline, and now members are beginning to jump ship. Even Arthur, given his new condition, is less enthused. He teams up with Sadie to break John out of prison and reunite him with his family. Then, he sets his sights on helping Rains Fall and the Wapiti people settle their conflict with the US government. Once again, Dutch decides to act upon yet another ruthless impulse. He convinces Rains Fall's son, Eagle Flies, to attack the US compound. Dutch plans to use the attack as a distraction to escape the eyes of the US Army. But like the Vanderlyn scheme, there's a price to pay. Eagle Flies is killed in the altercation. Charles Smith leaves the gang and stays to help the Wapiti people through their time of loss and hardship. Dutch drums up one last job for the remaining members. The gang will rob a train filled with enough army payment for the gang to finally retire. But of course, the job is only semi-successful. Dutch and Micah run off with the loot, but John is shot during the robbery and presumed dead. Meanwhile, the Pinkertons raid the gang's campsite, capture Abigail, and force the final members to flee. Javier, Dutch, Micah, and Bill Williamson decide to leave her behind, while Sadie and Arthur go rescue her. Van Horn. Sadie and Arthur lead a successful attack on the Pinkertons, and Agent Milton is killed in the process. They also learn from Agent Milton that Micah has been an informant for the Pinkertons ever since they returned from Guarma. Sadie then rides off with Abigail to safety, while Arthur goes after Dutch and Micah. The end of the Vanderlyn gang. Arthur confronts Micah, but he denies the accusations, leaving Dutch confused. John also arrives, revealing he was shot and left for dead, having been disowned by his own mentor. The remaining gang members all draw their weapons in a standoff, until the Pinkertons arrive once more, shooting up the campsite. John and Arthur flee into the woods, where Arthur tells John to leave his life of crime and start over with Abigail and Jack. Arthur provides a distraction for John to escape and faces off against Micah. Arthur dies there, as the rest of the gang parts ways. And so ends the story of Arthur Morgan. But before this timeline tumbleweed keeps rolling, here's a quick reminder to sign up for the Leaderboard's ongoing console giveaway. Just head to leaderboard.nyc/giveaway and log in with a social account to enter. 1907. John Marston's new beginning. By this point, John, Abigail, and Jack are living life on the run. They're trying to leave their gunslinging past behind them, but it's proving to be more of a challenge than they originally thought. When the family arrives at the town of Strawberry, John gets saddled with a quick job delivering goods to Pronghorn Ranch for the local general store. At Pronghorn Ranch, John chases off the Laramie boys, rival ranchers, and prevents them from robbing the ranch. The ranch owner, Mr. Geddes, decides to keep John and his family around so John can protect Pronghorn. John quickly learns the way of the rancher, but a trip to the local post office reveals his true identity to the public. Some men confront him, seeking revenge, and John is forced to kill again. The incident makes Abigail worry that John may fall back into old habits. Their worries only grow as John assists Mr. Geddes in retaliating against the Laramie boys. John kills their leader and puts an end to the rivalry between the two ranches. Abigail becomes so concerned that she runs off with Jack the next morning. To convince Abigail to come back, John gets a loan to buy a piece of property named Beecher's Hope and starts a ranch of his own. John reunites with Uncle, Sadie, and Charles, who all help him build up the property. John also begins bounty hunting with Sadie to repay the loan. A new man, John writes to Abigail, asking her to return. When she does, John proposes to Abigail, and they begin their new life together, looking after the land and nursing it back to health. Sadie learns of the whereabouts of Micah Bell and recruits the help of Charles and John to track him down. Despite Abigail's pleas, John joins in the pursuit to avenge Arthur. They eventually confront Micah at his cabin in the Snowy Mountains and have a standoff. Dutch reveals himself and joins in the standoff. He then shoots Micah and takes his leave, surrendering the gang's hidden money stash to John, Charles, and Sadie. John returns to Beecher's Hope, pays off his loan, and formally marries Abigail. The Marstons finally settle into their new lives on the right side of the law, until a federal agent by the name of Edgar Ross tracks him down 4 years later. 1911, Red Dead Redemption, a new era begins. The days of the Wild West are numbered, and the government is actively rounding up the last known outlaws in their final effort to civilize the land. John Marston, now in the custody of 2 FBI agents, is cooperating with the government to take down the nefarious Bill Williamson, leader of the Williamson Gang, at Fort Mercer. Although Bill and John were once thick as thieves during the Vanderlyn days, John is driven by the desire to save his family. The FBI is holding Abigail and Jack captive as a bargaining chip. Edgar Ross, head of the agency, promises that the Marstons will be free to live a lawful life without the constant worries of prosecution and, well, death. All John has to do is help track down the remaining members of the Vanderlyn gang. Once John arrives at Fort Mercer, the whole plan goes down the tubes. He is met with only hostility from his former outlaw brother, Bill. Bill shoots John down right outside the fort, leaving him for dead. Thanks to a random act of kindness, John is saved by Bonnie McFarland, the owner of the nearby McFarland Ranch. She and her father seek medical attention for John's wounds, and after a successful recovery, John wakes up to discover he is indebted to the McFarlands, about $15 worth. But that's a lot of money in the Old West. So, to repay them, John helps Bonnie with chores around the ranch until he's healed enough to continue his search for Bill. Along the way, John then comes into contact with the District Marshal of Armadillo, Leigh Johnson. Johnson assures John that he'll help with his Bill Williamson troubles. That is, if John helps with a few local goons first. During his time accompanying the Marshal, John meets 3 other characters that will help lead him to Bill Williamson. First, there's a shifty snake oil salesman named Nigel West Dickens. After saving his life, John helps Nigel sell his herbal remedy in exchange for his assistance. Nigel then sends John off to meet Seth, a grave robber that needs help seeking a phony treasure. Later, Seth introduces John to a drunkard by the name of Irish, who has a line on some pretty heavy firepower. Finally, all of John's quid pro quo errands pay off. He and his new ally storm Fort Mercer, using the classic Trojan horse technique. John hides in Nigel's cover wagon with Irish's Gatling gun, while Seth serves as a distraction. However, Bill Williamson is long gone at this point, having fled to Mexico to meet up with another of the Dutch Vanderlyn gang members, Javier Escuela. Mexico. John travels to Mexico in search of Bill and Javier, but once he crosses the border, he is immediately greeted with trouble from the locals. A stranger intervenes by the name of Landon Ricketts, a famed gunslinger in the Wild West. John recognizes Landon from the stories he was told as a young man, and Landon teaches John a few gunslinging tricks, like how to use the Deadeye. When John crosses the border, he discovers Mexico is in the middle of a revolution, but John's not interested in Mexican politics. He helps whichever side will get him closer to Bill and Javier. Vincent de Santa, captain of Mexico's army, discovers that John has been helping the rebels and betrays him. But before John bites the bullet, he's saved by the leader of the revolution, Abraham Reyes. Looks like John's finally picked a side of the revolution. First, John and Abraham catch up with Javier. Javier claims that Bill is hiding with the head of the country's armed forces, Colonel Allende. With Javier dealt with, John and Abraham storm Allende's villa and find him and Bill trying to flee, but bring a swift end to them both. Abraham assumes power and John bids him farewell, returning to West Elizabeth. The hunt for Dutch. Back in the States, John receives a tip on the whereabouts of Dutch. After enlisting the help of a Native American named Nastas and an ex-Yale professor named Harold McDougall, John discovers that Dutch has a new band of followers. He's convinced the local tribe to join him in his fight for a utopia free from government oppression and has been hiding at Cochene, a mountainous village occupied by the local tribe. The FBI, US Army, and John all take on Dutch and his new gang, and their combined efforts prove to be too much for Dutch to handle. He commits suicide, and with Dutch out the picture, John is free to go home. John's return to Beecher's Hope. John returns to his ranch to find Uncle, Jack, and Abigail all waiting for him. He continues to enjoy his new life once more, teaching young Jack how to be a rancher and actively steering him away from a life of crime. Life is peaceful, until a band of government agents, accompanied by the US Army, arrive to terminate the real remaining members of Dutch's gang. John sends Abigail and Jack away before stepping outside to take his final stand and accept his fate. John's story ends there, in a hail of bullets. 1914, Jack's revenge. Now that Abigail has passed, Jack decides to become an outlaw, hell-bent on revenge. He tracks down the recently retired Edgar Ross and challenges him to a duel. In a shallow victory, Jack guns down the man that double-crossed his father and continues the Marston legacy. If your trigger finger is still itching, shoot over to our 107 Facts video about Red Dead Redemption 2. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more awesome videos like this one and much more, all right here on the Leaderboard.